Please only use the chat for your questions. At the end, Alicia Keenan will curate your questions and send them to me via chat, and I will present them to our speaker. Now I'm going to ask Alicia, who's usually behind the scenes, but is here live in the flesh today. She is our new chair of the Racial Justice Committee and also our communications chair in the Volusia Flagler chapter. She is responsible for recruiting tonight's speaker, and so I'm going to allow her to introduce him.
Yes.
I'll be back at the end.
Thank you very much. So welcome everyone. And tonight we're going to hear from Dr. Leroy Long, who's going to talk about the need for educational systems that prioritize mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of Black people as it relates to STEM. Dr. Long is an associate professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida, where he directs a research team called Engineering, Arts, and Sports Engagement, EASE. Dr. Long's research includes educational equity and racial justice, student retention and career readiness, as well as students' ethical reasoning and technology use with focus on STEM students. He has focused most of his research on the academic and social experiences of Black and Latinx student groups. Dr. Long helped to lead research funded by the NCAA Innovations in Research and Practice grant to improve the well-being of student athletes in STEM through support of their career readiness. Dr. Long earned his PhD in STEM education at Ohio State University. I'm from Ohio, by the way. He earned his master's in mechanical engineering also at the same university and his bachelor's in mechanical engineering at Wright State University. In 2021, this year, Dr. Long became the first Black person to earn tenure in the College of Engineering at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. So Dr. Long, welcome, and please take it away.
Thanks for having me. Can you all see my screen okay?
Mm-hmm.
You can hear me just fine as well?
Yes, we can hear you well.
All right. Well, thanks for joining. I know it's a serious topic. I'll try to present it in a, I guess, entertaining and informative manner if possible. And so the title, as she mentioned, is Educational Equity and Racial Justice in STEM. And then I added a subtitle From the Schools to the Streets, just so we can understand it doesn't just start and stop in the school system, but it actually carries over into everyday life. And so I'm also the manager and founder of an LLC called We Need More. And as she mentioned, I'm an associate professor of engineering at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. If you're a type person who likes social media, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is just at Dr. Leroy Long III. You can also subscribe to my YouTube page, Dr. Leroy Long III. I'm on LinkedIn, just Leroy Long III, and then I have a website, leroylong3rd.com. So again, welcome, and I'll get right into the talk. All right, and so if we want to define racism, right, I think one go-to person who I always think of first is Dr. Ebony McGee, who's a full professor at Vanderbilt. And so she, in my opinion, is the leading expert on racism within a STEM context, right? And so although I'm being tapped to give this talk, I want to give kudos first and foremost to her because I think she's laid the groundwork, done most of the preliminary or really in-depth analysis. And so her book, which you see on the slide, I actually have here physically, so I would encourage you to get a copy of it as well. It really dives into, years and years of work that was funded as a National Science Foundation Career Award and then subsequent awards in this area. And so she says that racism comes in many flavors. And so she mentions several types of racism: structural, institutional, everyday, colorblind, individual, interpersonal, and unconscious. And beside the book, she also has a recent journal article from 2020 called Interrogating Structural Racism in STEM Higher Education, which the quote is coming from there originally, and then it's in her book as well. And so both dive into it, but the book is much more in-depth, really easy, enjoyable read. So I would encourage you to check it out again if you have a chance. And so I'll just start to go into her definitions of racism, just so you can understand why this topic is important and how it manifests itself in many different avenues of life. And so in the US context, many people believe the origins of racism, or at least the furthest back that you can trace it, would be enslavement of Black people. And so 1619 being the start of that point in time and not ending until 1865. And so it's not that far back in history. Some people tend to believe it's just this distant past, but there are individuals like myself who have just a few generations ago, individuals who were enslaved and then lasting legacies of it. And so after enslavement, you have individuals who are starting to come up. You know, the first Black male to get a PhD actually was in physics. And so you would think, you know, that achievement would be celebrated and it would continue. That was Edward Boucher. But then you have Jim Crow laws and other things setting back people. So that took place from 1877 to the 1960s. And then during that time, you have situations like redlining going on with housing, which directly affects school systems, and I'll get into that. And then to this day, you still have instances of mass incarceration, which you know, creates increased levels of anxiety, hypersurveillance, emotional, physical, mental trauma on Black, you know, people, and at times, in particular, Black men and younger Black men, such as myself. All right, so I'll start with the first definition in the upper left-hand corner, which is about structural racism. And I just want you to understand that although we're talking about education for the most part today, structural racism really is tied together. And so education is really just a part of this greater web of the way structural racism oppresses people of color, and in particular, Black people. And so it's in healthcare, it's in housing, it's in employment, it's in the amount of money we can earn, the benefits we receive, the credits or credentials we are able to get. It's shown in the media, it comes up in politics, and it's a part of the criminal justice system. So I will just tell you a little bit about myself, just so you understand how it impacts me. But I am a Black man from Dayton, Ohio, which is considered the birthplace of aviation. It's also known for other things like the first NFL game, if you're into sports, funk music, if you like it, Paul Laurence Dunbar, if you're into the arts. And so growing up in Dayton, Ohio, I experienced this from birth. And so when I came of age, you know, I'm walking, talking, getting into the school system, I already had an awareness of my skin color, of being Black, of racism. And so just going to school wasn't the only time I experienced it. It was the segregated housing. The west side of Dayton, and to an extent into the northwest side, is where the majority of Black people lived. On the east side and then surrounding suburbs, southern suburbs being more affluent, is where the majority of white people live. So it was very segregated. The schools that I attended, ironically, my high school, which was a public Dayton public school, my father went to that same high school. So just in a generation, when he attended, it was predominantly white. By the time I attended, it was 80, 90% Black at that point in time. So schools were resegregated during my generation. I certainly saw that. Employment options, many Black people were forced, if they wanted a good paying job, to work at the local Air Force base. There weren't other opportunities available to them. So they couldn't realize their dreams. They had to just take those jobs. And so I'll stop there, but I just wanted to give that general context, and I'll share a little bit more about myself as we get further into the talk. All right, and so one stat that may be glaring to you on this slide is the funding gap that exists. And so I mentioned that I lived in a city that was segregated by race and also by socioeconomic class. It was true in our schools. And so in my schools, which were public, inner city, predominantly Black, you know, you could tell that the facilities weren't up to par. I was in the same building again as my father. So I'm not sure how old those buildings were, but decades old. You drive into the suburbs, the schools look like college campuses. And so the $23 billion funding gap, I lived it, I saw it. You know, books, computers, the resources were not there. I had great, loving teachers, you know, highly educated, well-trained. I had a lot of peers, you know, who encouraged me, built me up, but the facilities, the resources were not there. And that funding gap was part of the redlining that we saw. So that division between one side of town and the other side existed for me from birth. All right. And so if we move from structural racism to institutional racism, it starts to talk about what I just mentioned as an example, less funding for predominantly Black schools. And it's not just at the K through 12 level, it actually goes up to the collegiate level with HBCUs, which stands for historically Black colleges and universities. And so Dr. McGee, who I mentioned in the previous slide, she, again, is at Vanderbilt in Tennessee. And she mentioned in the book and in her other research that there is a $100 million gap between a historically Black college like Tennessee State and the predominantly white public schools in her home state. And so, or at least her current state. And so it's unfortunate right, that we're aware of it with housing, we're aware of it, again, affecting K through 12 schools, but even at the collegiate level, where the government should be distributing resources not only equally, but equitably, there's still a huge gap in funding, right? There have been stories coming out from Howard University about housing, and that's directly due to a lack of government funding and support, even just support from local corporations. I know there's always a debate of whether you're public or private and how that may affect funding, but regardless, an institution like Howard, which has been one of the leading institutions for Black students in terms of higher education, should not have issues with housing, as we've seen come up in the news. They should have sufficient support, from the local, national level. All right, a few other things that you'll see for institutional racism is when you're at a school, predominantly white school, for instance, you'll see it embedded within the laws, the policies, the way that you're evaluated. So what are the standardized test scores? What are the ways that grades are distributed? Who's in positions of power? Is the board of trustees all white men? The president, provost, and upper level administrators, all white men? And how does that inform the way people are thinking and behaving? Is it all based on a Eurocentric perspective, a Eurocentric male perspective? And so then it's allowing white supremacy to flourish and for anyone who's outside of that spectrum to be oppressed. All right, so I'll continue to move on and define other elements of racism. And so here is showing some statistics about underrepresentation of Black and Hispanic workers in STEM jobs. And so basically it's saying of all individuals who are employed, 65% are white. And so when you look at STEM jobs, it's actually 69% white, 13% Asian. So 6% Asian for all jobs, but 13% for STEM jobs, 65% white for all jobs, but 69% when you get to STEM. And so really the biases really come about. I mentioned dreams deferred, right? If you grow up, you love math and science or some other aspect of STEM, it could be engineering, it could be just technology. If you're a Black child in America, you can't necessarily realize your dreams because you're not given entry or opportunity into these forms of employment. And so you can look specifically as it relates to various types of industries. And unfortunately, as an engineering professor, and partly why I do this type of research, you can see that we're actually the worst in terms of racial representation, racial equality. 73% of employees in engineering are white, 12% are Asian. So really a lot of work needs to be done in my field specifically. And I don't want to carry the burden or the responsibility. I didn't create these systems, nor do I maintain them. So I'm just really shining light to try to raise awareness. And so many times when we look at these statistics, you'll just try to say, maybe, or someone will tell you in defense, well, I don't know what's going on. We just can't find them, right? Where are they? Why don't we have more people of color who are interested in STEM? Why don't we have more people of color who are going into STEM? But rarely do we actually point blame or responsibility on the gatekeepers. So there are individuals who want to go into these majors. And really, when you look at data about first-year college students, the interest level is pretty similar across racial groups. You will see some levels could be slightly higher for white students at times, or maybe Asian students, but it is really high across all of those groups. And what happens is you may have a high school guidance counselor who's not telling you how to go to, the best engineering school in the nation, or what is needed in terms of extracurricular activities, AP, IB, dual enrollment courses. You're not given the proper resources to prepare for standardized tests, and those are racially biased. And we've known that through decades of research. You're not given access to high school courses in STEM, like algebra. And with that $23 billion funding gap, you'll actually see that at predominantly Black and brown schools, they are less likely to have access to algebra, computer science, calculus, physics, chemistry, many courses that are needed at the first, second, third year when you're first getting into engineering or other STEM majors. You don't even have access to it. So if I enjoy this material, if I want to do well in it, how can I have the opportunity to go to college or to get a job in industry if I'm not even given access to the curriculum, right? Gifted education, that's been coming up with a recent story in New York about them pulling it. But gifted education has had a history of racial bias and segregation there. And so rigorous coursework, which Black students do want, despite stereotypes that say otherwise, tend to not get access because you have, teachers, and the majority of K through 12 teachers are actually white women who are getting to tap the students they believe are worthy of taking those courses. So their own biases, whether they're implicit or explicit, may come up and stop it. And I mentioned advanced placement courses already, but again, recognizing that there are people stopping individuals from going into these spaces is not due to a lack of interest. It's not due to a lack of talent or ability. There are individuals who are stopping it. So let's focus more on the gatekeepers and the stopgaps rather than saying it's something wrong with Black and Hispanic students or workers. All right, to continue our definitions of racism, we also have everyday racism. And so an individual like myself, whether I'm at work, whether I'm at home, whether I have on a collared shirt or a dry fit or a fitted hat, or I have no hat on, whether I have on shades, meaning sunglasses or no sunglasses, I deal with everyday racism. So there's no way to avoid it in my Black skin, despite people telling me, well, if you dress up or you talk a certain way, or with your credentials, no one sees that when they see me, out and about. Even on campus, I'm confused many times due to my youthful appearance for being like a student, which I embrace. I'm kind of like the Steph Curry of academia, with my looks, but I embrace it. But again, everyday forms of racism where there are these biases about what I possess and what other Black people possess biologically and culturally, right? And that really bleeds into STEM curriculum because a lot of it was developed by eugenics researchers, people who believe that Black people were inherently less than. And so a lot of the curriculum needs to be challenged, it needs to be dismantled, it needs to be recreated, right? And then other ways you see everyday racism manifest itself are just that they view race as structural, right? And so I'm not racist, it must be something else going on, I have no involvement in it, right? And that they don't see race as something that's socialized, that again, is not biological, it's a socialized mechanism. I'm not born technically Black, you labeled me Black just because my skin complexion is darker. And then it's deeply embedded still, as I mentioned before, into US laws, policies, regulations, and rules. And so again, giving credit to Dr. McGee and her definition so far for structural, institutional, and everyday racism. All right, but we'll move along to colorblind. And so this really became popular during President Obama's administration, in which people saw a Black man ascend to the quote unquote highest level of professional success in society, becoming the first US president who was Black. And so they're like, well, obviously racism doesn't exist, right? Look at President Obama or look at Oprah Winfrey, right? There's no way you can have racism when you have Black billionaires and individuals who are really successful. But just because you have a few, or maybe even one, who makes it, myself included, being the first Black person, I believe, to get tenure within my college and potentially the first Black man of US descent, meaning descendants of those who were enslaved, to get tenure at the entire university. That doesn't mean that the majority of Black people still aren't facing racism, and that I don't encounter it, right? But again, it minimizes racism in this definition. It makes it seem like racism is this distant past. Only my great ancestors dealt with racism. I'm not dealing with it. My students aren't dealing with it. My coworkers aren't dealing with it. And Black people in general are no longer dealing with it. Because again, obviously we had President Obama. Obviously we have Oprah Winfrey, so racism doesn't exist. And what that causes is for individuals like myself who are encountering racism, all right, then they're just saying, well, if it's a problem, and I admit some of my early research even talked about confidence and resilience, then you actually have to take on unhealthy forms of resilience. And so certainly kudos to my ancestors, to my peers, to my mentors, and even to myself at times when we exhibit forms of resilience in the face of racism. But we should not have to lose sleep. We should not have to deal with mental, emotional, physical trauma, right? We should not have to keep pushing through. It is not our responsibility to endure, right? Remove the systems of oppression so that we can thrive, so that we can flourish. So the last thing it talks about is that the education system continues to abuse and neglect not only our bodies, but our minds. And so again, if we are saying it doesn't really happen, we're blind to it, we don't see race. I hear people saying things like, I don't see color, I don't see difference. I'm fine with being called Black. I don't see anything wrong with you recognizing my skin, but I would hope and recognize this because you think Black complexion is beautiful. Just like you would think if you're a white person, your own complexion is beautiful. That you would think if I have cultural differences from yours, that those are beautiful and worthy of being celebrated. And not just that you're looking to appropriate my culture and fashion and sports and other forms of entertainment, but again, that you're celebrating it authentically and giving credit to those who actually created it, such as some of the backlash with TikTok in recent years. And TikTok is a newer social media platform, if you're not familiar with it, where there have been some younger white people on there who have received a lot of money and a lot of followers for essentially copying the original creations for dances and other cultural creations from Black artists. All right, and so how does racism manifest itself in the school? So I've defined it at this point, but how does it manifest itself in the school? So I talked about a little bit of my identity. I'm going into more detail about that. So again, I went to segregated K-12 schools, but fortunately, again, I had great Black teachers. I had a mother and father who were first generation college students. I had grandparents who were the first generation to integrate their K-12 schools, my mother's mother, my father's father. And so I benefited from all these things. Both of my grandfathers were first generation homeowners. One of my grandfathers migrated from the South to the North. So I benefited from all these things. I have, family members of lighter complexions, and at times they may have received advantages. So I'm just being open and honest. But when I was going to my public school system, there weren't, again, a lot of affordances or people believing we could go into higher education. But I attended a summer STEM program called Right Step, which stood for Science, Technology, Engineering Preparatory Program. And so that happened in middle school and high school for me and came with a tuition-based scholarship. And so that's actually how I got introduced to STEM. And that's what really benefited me to the point where today I'm able to be a homeowner without being in serious debt. All right. But I started to encounter the same academic and social barriers that you'll see in one of my papers from the time I was ending graduate school and transitioning into my faculty role, which meant that when I enrolled at my predominantly white undergraduate institution, even with a tuition-based scholarship, because I was one of few Black people in my engineering classes, I still felt alone and invisible. As the nearly 50 Black and Hispanic students that we interviewed would tell you as well. Again, I lacked same race peers and faculty. And so despite the fact this program existed for decades at Wright State University, where I went for undergrad, they didn't have Black faculty in the class. So you would think that they would have at least recruited alums from the institution to teach me, but I only had a Nigerian faculty member who was in an administrative role, never in the classroom for me as a source of a mentor. And so again, I was alone and invisible, like same race faculty and peers. And then certainly there can be difficulty applying theory to practice. And so if I'm not given real world hands-on projects, which fortunately I did get those. Fortunately, I benefited. I got an internship with Toyota, right? But if it's not occurring in the curriculum, many students are saying here, and there were times in which I didn't have that ability, we can't translate it, right? So let's take it out of the clouds and let's bring it down into something practical. Sports actually uses STEM despite stereotypes telling you otherwise. So when people even dance, they're using physics and elements of STEM. When people cook, they're using STEM. Gardeners, farmers, right? Manual laborers, construction workers, they're using STEM. And so let's quit, making it seem like it's this mystery. Let's demystify it and show that there are ways to connect it. It doesn't have to be theory. We can show how it connects to actual practices in society. And lastly, pre-college preparation. And so unfortunately, when I was in K-12 school, I took calculus junior year of high school, didn't have opportunity to do dual enrollment. So I just sat back in on the same class senior year and probably knew less when I graduated high school than I did after my junior year because I wasn't as engaged with the curriculum having already taken it. And so those are ways in which pre-college preparation is not available. And although I had access to IB, International Baccalaureate, many students do not have access to AP, IB, or dual enrollment. And so that was an earlier study, actually one of my most cited publications to date. And I just want to give kudos to my co-authors, Dr. Terrell Strayhorn, Joseph Kitchen, and Michael Stephen Williams, who contributed to that work with me. All right. And then as I was transitioning into my faculty role, I started to talk more about institutional level barriers. And so not just academic and social, but what's occurring at the institutional level. And I had the pleasure of collaborating with Joel, who goes by Alex. And so Alex, if you may think or question based on his name, his ethnic identity, he does identify as a Hispanic or Latinx man. And so we were talking about our K-12 experiences and how that actually carried over into college. And so Alex mentioned, for instance, having an advisor who didn't believe in his abilities, who wasn't preparing him for college or trying to make sure that he was, able and ready to do so. I mentioned a time that once I got to college that I decided to take entry-level courses, and I encourage students to do the same in calculus and physics at a community college because the classes were smaller, the instructor's pace, more so matched my style of learning. And luckily, my scholarships transferred to that community college. But many times, you don't have that type of working relationship between a four-year institution and a community college. And so although the community college is cheaper, if you are on a scholarship, they would need to be separate or something outside of that institution in order for you to be able to take those courses. And we touch on many other things too, such as deficit-based thinking, which Alex encountered, and other elements in terms of lack of funding, bias with assessments like the SAT, ACT. So you can read either one of those articles if you're interested in some of my work. All right. So I mentioned, again, the definitions of racism so far. I talk about how it appears in school systems. Now I'll talk about how it actually bleeds out or leaks into the streets. All right. And so one person who I think is doing great work in this area, Dr. Ayanna Howard, and I should say the individuals on the previous slide all have PhDs as well. So they do go by the title of doctor, all college professors. Dr. Ayanna Howard is really Dean Ayanna Howard now because she's Dean of Engineering at The Ohio State University after leaving Georgia Tech. And so she has an audiobook, which I was able to read. And with the trial version, you may be able to read it for free. So I would encourage you to check it out. But she talks about how the biases, that unconscious racism, the everyday racism, are now being programmed into artificial intelligence, right? And you would think it only has harsh impacts on people like us. I'm not sure if you've heard about soap dispensers and wash dispensers not recognizing darker skin, right? Or maybe with some of the vehicles now that are automated, they're not recognizing Black people. So it's possible they could hit a Black person if that Black person were crossing the street, right? Or that if I'm searching Google, that information about Black people is stereotypical or rooted in racial biases of white men. So many, many different layers. Healthcare, if it's automated in terms of who receives medication and who doesn't, right? Biases occurring. But again, we are all negatively impacted by this, right? So if you're aware of the Moderna vaccine, that actually came out, was created or co-created by a Black woman, Black researcher. And without her presence, without the presence of Black researchers keeping us safer, again, in terms of automation with driving, with vehicles, with technology, you've seen things happen politically, where we have misinformation going out. All people of all colors, all ethnicities are negatively impacted when Black people aren't properly represented and when artificial intelligence isn't created by us as well, right? And so you can't just have all white men, all Asian men doing this work. You need Black people deeply involved in it as well. And so I'll stop there with this slide, but I would encourage you to listen to it. I don't want to give out too many, kind of nuggets or spoilers with the book, but it is an easy listen, a great book. I think it takes about 6 hours to read it. I know I read it over many different days or listened to it, I guess, since it was audio, but I would encourage you to check it out as well. All right, and so if racism is encountered by Black and brown people in many different fashions, structural, institutional, everyday, colorblind, how are we responding to it, right? I mentioned the need to protect us mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. How have we been responding, right? What are the costs of it? Many times you see success stories, people like me, but you don't know the costs, right? You don't know that I've dealt with anxiety at times when I'm in racist settings, right? That I feel like part of the reason I went to counseling in graduate school, in large part, was due to racism. It wasn't due to anything else. It was what I was having to prove and what I was having to do in those settings. And so it does have dire effects. There are some individuals who believe that cancer, is higher rates because we're taking on the burdens and weight of racism, whether that's in terms of stress or not receiving access to proper healthcare, which I'm sure came up if you were able to listen like me in the previous talk on racism and healthcare. All right, so again, how are we responding? A leading researcher in this area is Dr. James Moore. He's also at Ohio State, and he actually was instrumental in getting me to become a faculty member. And so I want to give him credit for that. When I was in graduate school getting my master's in mechanical engineering after earning my undergraduate in mechanical engineering, I really thought I would just go back in industry, work for a company like Toyota. But he had a program called Bell Fellows for really Black and brown researchers, and specifically those who did research on Black students, to matriculate us into roles of being professors. But prior to me even meeting him and him doing that work, his dissertation coined a term called prove them wrong. And I feel like this defines, a response I've had typically, and same is true for many of my colleagues in predominantly white settings, whether that's in school or in the streets, where because we know stereotypes are wrong, racialized stereotypes, we constantly feel like we have to show you that, deficit-based thinking I'm less intelligent, thinking I'm less hardworking, thinking that your notions of professionalism are true and accurate, that again, if I'm not wearing a collared shirt, I'm not professional. If I don't have on a tie, I'm not professional. If I don't code switch, that I'm not professional, right? When this is really rooted in white norms, European norms and standards, right? What if I was wearing a dashiki? Does that make me less professional, which is an African, cultural norm? And so again, what are the costs? And so we're going against notions of Black intellectual inferiority. It positively can motivate us to succeed. It positively can help us persist, but at what cost? All right, so I would encourage you to read his article if you're interested in learning more about it, but again, a leading expert specifically on the experiences of African-American men in engineering. All right, so I'll bring up Dr. Ebony McGee again. And so she talked about many times Black math students, but also has done work with engineering students. And she extended the work of Dr. Moore, and she coins it stereotype management. And so not just am I trying to prove them wrong, but I'm having to manage these stereotypes. So I should also give kudos to Claude Steele. So his work as well in terms of stereotype threat. So she's using James Moore's prove them wrong, Claude Steele stereotype threat, and now she's coined stereotype management. And so it does, again, motivate Black people to succeed. We are able to combat or disprove notions of Black intellectual inferiority. But again, at what cost? Are we now suffering from emotional trauma, physical trauma, mental trauma? Am I not sleeping? Am I not eating, able to concentrate, right? What she noticed is with maturity, her participants were moving away from the prove them wrong theory, and they start to define their own reasons for wanting to succeed. And kind of on a lighter note, one thing that Dr. McGee talks about in her book and really in public talks is that she loved the Jetsons as a kid. She thought and still thinks that we should be flying. And if, the STEM field was more racially equitable, that you would have the talent there for these things to be occurring. And so that's a self-defined reason, right? I want to be like the Jetsons. One of my mentees I'm most proud of, or I guess she's not a doctor yet, but I'm going to go ahead and give her the title, just really with positive energy going her way. She will become, in my mind, Dr. Nia Butler Craig. Currently, she's a PhD student at Georgia Tech, but she wants to be an astronaut like Mae Jemison, right? And so I think that's a self-defined reason, right? Again, my love for aviation coming from Dayton, which also transitioned into a love of automobiles, self-defined reason to want to succeed or do well in the field, right? One of my close friends, he is in welding. And so he really likes to do things with his hands, with welding. We have an interest in maybe starting an automotive dealership or automotive repair shop or something with automobiles, right? But that's a self-defined goal. Maybe it's just that I want to help my family economically. Maybe it's I want to solve issues with, diseases and things of that sort, self-defined reasons. So these were more positive. These were healthier ways for Black people to cope. And so again, it did lead to higher levels of achievement and resilience, at least if it were in a positive manner and not the unhealthy forms of resilience I mentioned earlier. All right. And so I talked about the definitions of racism. I talked about some of the work I've done in this area, responses to racism. What would I recommend that we do, right? Or what have others recommended? So I'll start with what I consider to be leading experts above and beyond my own, because really I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. This work is not new. It's been decades in the making. And many times we pretend as if, these ideas are more novel than they really are when we just haven't been listening to Black voices. We haven't been citing Black scholars, but the work has been there. And so two people I'll mention, even though the screenshot here of Toward a Theory of Culturally Relevant Pedagogy doesn't mention William Tate with Gloria Ladson-Billings, both professors. William Tate is actually now the president of LSU. Gloria Ladson-Billings, I believe, has transitioned into retirement. So kudos to her for being able to do so. Hopefully she's enjoying it. They were talking about CRT, which we know has become relatively controversial in recent weeks, months, because individuals don't want you to talk about racism as we're doing today. They don't want to acknowledge that racism is stopping people from getting access to a better life, from being joyful, right? From living long, from being healthy, right, from being happy. They don't want you to talk about these things, for us having peace, all right, in terms of interracial relationships, for your best friend to potentially be someone of a different race, for your boss to potentially be someone of a different race, for the inventor that you go to, the people, the businesses that you support to be Black owned, to be Black people, all right? But their work was really talking about bringing that into the classroom. And so one, we wanted Black students to achieve academically, but we wanted to connect to their culture. So can we mention, if it's in the context of STEM, Black inventors? Can we mention things that matter to them? Sports, again, uses STEM, as I mentioned. Their parents, when they cook, they're using STEM, right? If they do gardening, they're using STEM. If someone works in construction in their family, they're using STEM. Again, when you're dancing, you're using physics. And so can we connect culture to the material, right? The majority of K-12 teachers are white women. Majority of higher education teachers or faculty members are still white men. Can they connect the material and curriculum to the culture of the students, right? And then can they raise critical consciousness amongst really all students, right? You don't want students to be colorblind. You don't want students to deny structural racism exists or institutional racism exists, right? And so making them conscious and aware so they can help to meet the needs of the current and future generation. So again, the burden doesn't rest on people like myself. I shouldn't have to lose sleep, trying to make a better life for my family or Black people as a whole, right? There should be white colleagues who join in the ranks, similar to what happened during the Freedom Rides, right? That we're coming together, all right? And so another person who I think has foundational work in this area is Dr. Sean Harper. And so he developed what we call an anti-deficit framework for doing research. But really, I think this framework is necessary when you do service, when you're just interacting with Black people in everyday life. Do you see them as valuable, as whole? Do you not believe that there is anything less than about them? And when you're trying to figure out what's wrong with the system, do you not always position it as what's wrong with Black and brown people? Really, we should avoid that thinking, right? How are people succeeding? How are they overcoming? And what systems are stopping them from succeeding? It's not due to Black people not being confident. It's not due to Black people not being resilient. It's not due to Black people not being intelligent. We possess all those attributes, all right? And so if we can make the curriculum, culturally relevant, if we can take our research, our service, our just everyday interaction with Black people and do it from an anti-deficit lens, then we're recognizing the achievements, we're recognizing the wholeness, we're recognizing the humanity of Black people. So I'll start with their recommendations and then I'll offer some as well. All right, so last summer in the wake of the George Floyd untimely murder and then the protests that followed, I had the opportunity to produce a guest editorial. It was originally published by JEE, the Journal of Engineering Education, which is a leading journal in my field. And then it was published a second time by Advances in Engineering Education. It was the first time I had a publication, published twice, which I thought was great that it, had that level of impact and interest. But what I was saying is if you want to create anti-racist engineering classrooms, here's a way you can go about doing it. So I offer 20 recommendations. I cite some of the people I mentioned, such as Gloria Ladson-Billings and William Tate. I highly cite Dr. Ebony McGee, Dr. James Moore. So these people that I'm showing here, their work is highlighted. And I'm really crediting them for establishing a foundation for us to do this. And so I would encourage you to read these papers as well. But basically, some of the things that you can do if you are an educator, again, bringing the contribution of Black people into the classroom, looking for ways to have equitable funding, right? Providing opportunities for joy, right? For, healing in the classroom. So if it can be a fun experience that recognizes Black people, that celebrates Black people, that humanizes Black people, and certainly if you can bring Black educators into the space like myself, then that work becomes even easier. And as a Black educator, it's not that I'm only able to serve Black students, but my lived experience makes it easier for me to identify with women. And it makes it easier for me to identify with low income people and others who've been from oppressed or marginalized and minoritized backgrounds. All right, and so I certainly can answer questions related to this work, but I'll move on to the next slide just for the sake of time, and then I can come back to any of these pages if you have questions about them. All right, I also want to give a shout out to a group I joined during 2020, which we coined Black in Engineering. We actually have a subgroup from NSBE, National Society of Black Engineers, where Black faculty across the country are involved. And it's called ARL, which is Academic Research Leadership. We have a symposium that we are part of at annual NSBE conferences. But in the wake of George Floyd, Dr. Monica Cox, Dr. Carlotta Berry, and Dr. Tahira Reed, they actually came up, with a way that we could all come together and try to tackle some of the issues we were seeing in society, and to really be transparent about instances, that hadn't been positive, issues that have been, traumatic for us, and to really just call out what was going on and what could be changed. And so there was a call to action, and I'll move to giving credit to the call to action to two other faculty members, Audrey Bowden and Cullen Bowie. And so they actually started a draft, and then Black faculty from across the country contributed to it, but they highlighted 5 key principles. And so the attitude of an institution, clarity, institutional accountability, personal accountability, and the commitment and resources. And they talked about 5 other kind of players here. So is it system-wide? Is it occurring from faculty, staff, graduate students, or undergrads? And so there is a free call to action that you can read, you can sign on and show your level of agreement towards it. But that's something that I would recommend for those who are interested in creating anti-racist spaces, especially in educational contexts. All right, other ways that you can get involved, right? So I mentioned reading and signing the call to action. You can subscribe to Black in Engineering. There's a YouTube channel. It is a 501c3, so you can make a tax-deductible donation, right? I have an LLC, I mentioned that earlier. It is a for-profit. So if you choose to donate or support it, I have poetry books, I have paraphernalia, t-shirts, hoodies, other things, hats. If you want to pay or donate to it, it is non-tax deductible, just showing the difference there depending on where your heart is or what you want to do. But we are trying to do positive things with it. So my LLC gives out scholarships. I use part of the revenue for outreach and community service, right? We do need resources to be redistributed at a personal level and then at a governmental level. So when we talk about reparations, the government has to step up, right? People have benefited off the backs, off of the labor of Black bodies. And so you can't just expect us to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, and we don't necessarily have boots. And then certainly if we don't have boots, we don't have bootstraps. I mentioned the funding differences already between K-12 schools, if they're predominantly Black versus if they serve predominantly white students, right? And the same thing happened at the level of higher education with HBCUs versus predominantly white schools. And so we do need resources. So if you have resources, if you know your ancestors unjustly benefited from the enslavement of Black people, please give to Black causes. Please support Black businesses like my own and others. Monica Cox has a Black business. Carlotta Berry has a Black business. And I don't know if they want, the shout out, but I'll say it, buying Ebony McGee's book, supporting the Bell Fellows program that Dr. Moore has, buying Ayanna Howard's audiobook. You can redistribute money to us, and we know individuals in the community who need and would love to have it. And then certainly calling on politicians, voting in ways that will change policy at the governmental level is certainly warranted and needed. But you can follow Black in Engineering on Twitter and Instagram. All right, and so in conclusion, as I mentioned when you were first introducing me, we do need to build. At times, building means rebuilding. At times, building means dismantling systems. We want to have ones that prioritize the mental, physical, emotional, spiritual well-being of Black people, specifically as it relates to STEM. All right, so I'll actually stop there. I'll give you a question to consider or think about, but it's really what will you do to help? So I mentioned redistributing resources, but certainly now that I've defined racism, how will you go about your interactions with people differently? What forms of structural racism will you try to change or call out? What forms of institutional racism will you try to change or call out? How can you no longer be colorblind when it comes to racism? Are there anything specific in terms of findings I shared from research that you'll try to use or implement, right? How will you go through the process of learning, unlearning, and that's a typo, I should say relearning there, all right? So what will you do? So I can take questions at this point, but I certainly appreciate your attentiveness and just this platform, the opportunity to speak. Again, I know it's a pretty weighty and heavy topic, but I hope we get to a point where we can celebrate Black people, where Black people can experience joy, and we're not always talking about our pain and suffering. And if we can remove the systems, right, if we can have better interactions interpersonally, then I don't necessarily have to be anxious. I don't have to lose sleep. I don't have to be stressed out or die prematurely while encountering racism. and you can have people who get to do the things I've done, because I feel like I'm living the dream in many ways, getting an undergraduate degree paid for, all the way up to my PhD paid for, Black faculty member on the tenure track, historic way in getting tenure. And hopefully over time, we don't have to keep having Black first. But again, I'll stop there and answer your questions. You can follow me on social media or subscribe or visit my website. So any questions?
Thank you, Dr. Long. Yes. Alicia, are you speaking?
Oh, do you mind if I take down your screen share?
Yes, I can take it down. I was just giving people a minute in case they needed my contact information, but I can stop it now.
Okay, now please put your questions in the comments. In the chat. Oops. There we go. I pressed the wrong button, but I'm back. All right, here we go. We're getting a lot of feedback about how thorough your resources were that you shared. So typically a lot of the questions at the end of these presentations are, what can I do? How can I contact with you? What can I, and you've answered all of exponentially. So my question is, I know that this is recorded, but can you share your slideshow with us, or do you have those resources on a document that could be sent out to the participants?
Yeah, so I can certainly, we can share the recorded presentation. I can put on my YouTube page, and I can even embed like maybe a Google Doc link or something to the presentation, and then anyone can go on there and access a public version of it to go along with them listening to me. They can just click through the slides at their own pace. So I can certainly make that available.
That would be great. Thank you, because there were so many resources that you shared. And I know that we have multiple people commenting about the wealth of resources and how appreciative they are. We've had to ask previous speakers, hey, can you put something, can you send us this stuff? And you already had it all there so very thoroughly.
Yeah, so, I don't want to take credit. Again, there's been a lot of work done in this area. So I'm just really making sure those individuals receive, the praise that's worthy. And then hopefully, yeah, you all do actually listen to the information.
Okay, here's the question. This is the question about artificial intelligence. Where is that headed? Where is it? The question says, where is that coming? I'm not sure what that means, but it says, so interesting, the information on artificial intelligence. Where is that coming? So I don't know, means where is that coming from, or where is that heading towards? But could you say more about that subject?
So I don't pretend to be an expert in artificial intelligence. Again, I would say Dr. Ayanna Howard or Dean Ayanna Howard is one. I can tell you how it affects me and what I see, in my personal and professional life. So I think personally, the way I've noticed it is, again, automated vehicles. And so if I were to drive a vehicle or be a pedestrian, I am concerned that if it can't recognize the complexion of someone who's Black, that, I could hit someone not intentionally doing it or be the victim of a car accident. When I do travel, or if I'm just going, because I haven't been in many public spaces during COVID, but if I'm going to wash my hands, I do notice at the soap dispensers, many times I have to turn my hands to the lighter side for them to work, right? That still is going on in 2021. So that's the way I encounter it. I've had numerous family members, in my opinion, die prematurely due to medical misdiagnosis, right? And some of that is artificial because there are certain algorithms that decide, like, when should you be treated for a medication or an ailment like cancer, or how high risk are you when it comes to that? What's your pain tolerance? And so I've seen it manifest itself there. I've seen it, sometimes it's used, or it can be used for like a selection of students with enrollment. So those are some of the ways that I see it impacting me. Another positive way, though, just so I'm not only doing the negative, stress relief for me during the pandemic was to get like a robotic vacuum cleaner. So just allowing it to roam the house, that's a benefit for me. Some of the automated features of my newer vehicle, in terms of if I'm veering out of a lane, Maybe because I'm distracted or I can't see clearly, that's a positive of AI. And so the more, again, Black people you can have in these spaces, we can circumvent bias and we can just enjoy and reap the benefits. We don't see the matrix actually occurring in real life, but really what we don't give credit to, and the same is true for social media, again, with the political ads and things that were coming up, the biases we hold as humans, that's really what's coming into AI. The lack of, awareness that we hold, that's coming through an AI. So AI is really just representing us, and it allows many of us to hide behind the scenes. Because one other thing I've noticed too when I'm driving sometimes is the cameras. And I've seen it downtown, even just walking. And Facebook came under fire for this too, with facial recognition. But I think to myself, how is that going to be used? Are the police going to try to target me if I'm considered an activist, or I protest, or I do research on racism? If I'm just out and about, are they going to bring someone there to harass me? Right? What is going to happen as a result of artificial intelligence? So those are ways in which I see it. Again, both negative and positive in my everyday life, personally and professionally, but I'm certainly not an expert on AI. I would recommend you check out the work of Ayanna Howard, Dr. Ayanna Howard, Dean Ayanna Howard. But great question, thank you.
Speaking of institutional racism, how has your research been received by those in your discipline?
So I think you always get like the sometimes pat on the backs, the smiles, maybe even a positive email, but I don't see the advocacy in terms of people being willing to, again, redistribute funds to cause this. So if I'm saying we're doing this work, I feel like I have to like tug and pull sometime to get people to donate or to buy an item. Even if it's a scholarship, we're educators, and getting people to contribute to a scholarship that I know it's going to have a positive impact on Black people. I question, again, if it's being received, if people are holding on to their wallets, holding on to their pocketbooks, when many of us live rather affluent lives, especially in the US. We get to travel, we can own multiple vehicles, we have houses with extra rooms that we use just for, workspace or exercise or guests when they come in town. So we can think, how can I save a little bit of money and then give it to those who actually are struggling, who are in need? Other times in which I question whether it's being received is when policies aren't being changed, whether that's like at my university level, within the field as a whole. Like, why did it take COVID for us to question using the SAT and ACT when decades of research showed it was racially biased, right? So again, positive in terms of interactions for the most part. I haven't had people harassing me, sending hate messages, but I don't know if the action piece is coming more so than just seeming like they're empathizing with the work. I would like it to move to actual action. I would like to see people even being willing to get fired. They take such a strong stance, they'll be fired, because I can get fired just for being Black, Now, fortunately, I'm tenured now, but I still question with all the things going on politically, if tenure is going to be revoked in many states across the country. All right. People couldn't even, participate in certain political actions. They were told, University of Florida, for instance, that they couldn't do that and remain faculty or be compensated. And then they reversed trends. So I don't feel as comfortable and safe, even in terms of my profession and being able to do these things and it being well received. But yes, there has been a certain level of empathy, but I would like it to move again to action. So another great question. Thank you.
And are you noticing an improvement in the enrollment of Black students at Embry-Riddle since your time there? What is the Black student population, and are you seeing improvements?
So I don't know if they want me saying this and whether I should be revealing the information. I'll just say sometime on a service level, when I'm like in the classroom, I haven't seen more Black spaces. That could be my sections in particular. I definitely take care of all the students who come my way. And so if you follow me on social media, you'll see me promoting their graduations. Some of them, have given personal testimonies, text, email. And so I certainly appreciate it. I take care of them, but I haven't seen, a large increase in enrollment. And I think part of that in my institution specifically is due to the cost. And so if we don't have scholarships dedicated to Black students specifically, I don't know how they're going to roll. If you don't have more Black faculty like myself, if I'm still the only, it's been, going on 7 years, well, our students going to want to come to that institution. They don't see Black peers, right? If the institution at the leadership level, right? And what I will say in defense of my institution, if I, can do so, this is typical across the country at many predominantly white institutions. They're not necessarily an outlier. The ones that may be somewhat different are in states that have higher percentages of Black and brown people. So Florida in general has a higher proportion of Black and Hispanic students in engineering at like UCF. At University of South Florida, at FIU, they have higher percentages than many other schools across the country, but that's because the state is more racially diverse. It's not necessarily that the institution is doing something special to recruit and support those individuals. But thank you for that question.
Okay, I'm going to read you this question. I'm going to admit that I don't know what some of these words mean, especially the abbreviations. So I'm going to leave this to you. So how do we rebut the idea that disciplines around CRT and WGSS are not rigorous enough in the face of white patriarchal hegemony in academia?
So I think it starts with some of the stereotypes I mentioned about notions of Black intellectual inferiority. Why is a theory that's been heavily used and cited by Black scholars one that's coming under critique? You know, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of theories that exist in higher education, and that's mainly where it's being used, despite people saying that it's being taught in K-12 schools. It's higher education, and not even at the undergraduate level, really at the PhD level primarily, less so even at the master's level is where these discussions are taking place. And it was bred out of the legal system after things like segregation were going on, and they were, you know, trying to improve life in general for Black people. But it's recognizing that we are intelligent, that the theories we push forth are believable, that they are real, right? That individuals like myself are credible, regardless of whether I'm affiliated with an Embry-Riddle Aeronautic University, that I'm credible through my LLC. I'm credible through, you know, the Black people who've taught me, because the majority of my K-12 teachers were Black women, despite the fact that nationally they're white women, right? That many of the mentors I've had starting K-12, but going into higher education have been Black people. It went from Black women, transition now mostly to Black men, right? That those people are deemed credible. And so I think that's what a lot of it is. And for us to get to the root of these conversations, it's really that they don't want the truth to come out about the history of the country, starting in 1619, the fact that Black bodies were considered an economic commodity, right? We were not deemed human, we were deemed a product, right? So our humanity was stripped of us, and it has not, still to this day, been fully recognized or appreciated. And until we get to a point where we see Black people as fully human, you're not going to recognize the theories that we bring forth, and you'll allow economic motivations to continue to cloud those discussions. You'll allow political agendas to cloud those discussions. But as a believer, a person of faith, you know, I believe critical race theory aligns with the teachings of Jesus. I believe Jesus was a social justice activist. And so someone who would counter that, I would say, is a liar. They're not speaking truth to you. Martin Luther King Jr. was a social justice activist. He would have promoted critical race theory. And he died because people thought he was a problem just by presenting these ideas. And so that's what I'll stand. I'll stand on my faith, which I believe supports critical race theory. I'll stand on even the people like Dr. King who are misrepresented but celebrated. I think they would back critical race theory. But it really just starts at recognizing the humanity and intelligence of Black people. So thank you.
All right. Let's see. It's 7:34. Do you have time for one more question?
Yes, I can take another question.
Okay. So let me pick one. Let's see. I'm looking to see what I haven't gotten to yet. Talked about this, you talked about that. Oh, okay. So could you please share some positive or negative experiences you had while searching for academic faculty positions?
So I don't know if I've shared this publicly, but Embry-Riddle was actually my top choice. The reason it was my top choice for a tenure track faculty position, I mean, I'll say some like less kind of serious things and then more serious reasons. So Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, where I was going to graduate school, it had like 2 brutal winters before I left. So we had a blizzard in terms of snow when I was writing my dissertation. So I was like stuck inside, but that helped me finish. And then we had a polar vortex where it was so cold, you really couldn't go outside without potentially getting frostbite or some other medical issue. So the weather in Florida was really appealing. That was one, benefit. Ohio has historically been a predominantly white state, where Florida has obvious, racial and ethnic diversity. So that was appealing to me. I had not moved away. I was kind of like LeBron James of academia in that sense. I had been in Ohio, only co-opted a state away in Kentucky with Toyota. And so I got a college experience, by going away. So like the way LeBron left Cleveland and went to Miami, I left Columbus and came to Daytona Beach. So those are positives for me. I was like, oh, I get to see what it's like to live somewhere else. It's sunny. There are beaches. There are a lot more Black and brown people. Hopefully it's going to be an easier life. It's going to be a better life. That's what I was thinking. And so that was the lighthearted things about the positives. Embry-Riddle did roll out the red carpet initially. They met all requests I had, I think pretty much for salary, startup packages, those things. So I will say that was a positive. But the negative about it is when I interviewed some places, you kind of wonder why they're asking certain questions and prying about, personal aspects of your life, whether you're married and trying to figure out things about your background. What does that matter? And really, legally, you're not supposed to ask those type of questions. Do you make jokes about like my youthful appearance and haven't even met me and don't know me well and aren't even concerned about my educational and professional background? Is that a distractor for you and a way for you to dismiss what I bring to the table in terms of positive things? And there were even individuals, high ranking at these institutions doing this. Like I went up like, oh, you look so young, you're a faculty member, and I'm like, yeah. And then the conversation didn't move from that. So I just had to remove myself from that space and stop talking to the individual. But these are some of the negative things that occurred. And then not even having a sensitivity towards relocation and the cost of that when you're like a poor graduate student and when you lack generational wealth, even being middle class, how are you expecting me to get here? And if my salary is delayed until I start, and the reimbursement from funds outside of what can fit on a moving truck is delayed, that's, a negative. When you get into the space, and although you saw all the Black people on campus when you were being interviewed, where are these people now? And why is it less people in certain spaces over time? Like what's happening? Why is it a difference between when you wanted me versus the realization of me being there? And then some people not even wanting to give me an offer for a tenure track job. So I had universities who wanted me to be like an administrator and do diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI work and do some teaching, but weren't going to give me the protection of tenure. And maybe didn't even believe that I was capable of balancing research, teaching, and service, even though I did it all throughout graduate school, master's and PhD. So I had like 6 years of experience doing this before the 6 years I've had now as a faculty member. And then other institutions like, oh, well, how do you rank us? Trying to play political games in terms of who they should give an offer to and whether I already had another offer on the table. So those are the negatives. But all of the forms of racism that I mentioned today, I've encountered them, continue to encounter them, every walk of my life, unfortunately. And the positive is when I have great students like Anaya Butler-Craig, like Charles Muse, who's at General Motors from Ohio State, when they're succeeding, realizing their dreams, that's when, I feel a lot better about the work that I'm doing in this space, and even people I'm mentoring who are younger than that, or even maintaining contact with alums. So it's not just that my work is done when they graduate, but I continue, if the relationship is there and there's an interest, to maintain, those interactions. And so those are some of the positives and negatives that I've encountered.
Well, thank you so much for answering the questions. Thank you for the great presentation. In addition to it being super informative, to give us very practical advice and also a series of action items to think about is excellent and exactly what we're always looking for. So
thank you.
I really appreciate your time. And now everyone, you can turn off your mutes and give your thanks and appreciation.
Thank you for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you, Dr. Leroy, for inviting me.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you, Dr.
Very
Long.
informative.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well done. Thanks,
Thank
Dr. Long.
you.
I'm so glad you're a professor. You're right in the best profession ever.
I'm glad you're in Florida.
And I'm glad you're in Florida, yes.
Yes.
And I'm glad you're at my church.
And so everyone, will meet again in January. Stay tuned. Don't get complacent.
Okay, well, happy holidays of all
Happy
flavors.
holidays. Yes, to everyone.
Thank you all. Stay healthy. and
Lots
safe.
of
Take care.
lots of things to think about now. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming.
Thank
Take-
you. Much
care.
success. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.